So with that, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker today. We are so honored to have Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University, a leading scholar of authoritarianism, propaganda and democratic protection. Many of us know her from her best-selling New York Times bestseller, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, and the published Substack that she has, Lucid, on the threats to democracy in the United States and globally. She is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, many other honors, and she is the advisor to an organization, Protect Democracy. And she does all she can, I think, to get out the word about how we can preserve our democracy. So, without further ado, I invite up Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat.
I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you so much to Henry Goldsmith, to the Reverend Dr. Chloe Breyer, and everyone at the Interfaith Center. Also to Troop Makandal for creating such uplifting and yet grounding energy to start our proceedings. And I'm really honored to be here and speak to you about the complex relationship of religion and authoritarianism. Thrilled that students are here too. I'll be talking to you later. So first I'm going to talk about how strongmen cultivate relations, the deals they strike with faith institutions. And then I'll talk about how religion has been a key component of resistance against tyranny. I'm probably going to talk more about the former. We have a panel later on today with specific case studies of resistance, of religious resistance, because I think that it's really important to understand how the regimes operate, how strongmen think and behave in order to resist them effectively. So starting off with that, we often define authoritarianism in political or legalistic terms. It's the expansion of executive power and the personal power of the head of state to the detriment of the independence of judiciary and other government institutions. And the leader's party and those government agencies can become his personal tools. And this is very important. The strongmen do not see any separation between public and private. Everything is theirs, to own, to manipulate, to plunder. And so government becomes a way of solving his personal legal or financial problems, like meaning enriching him, going after his enemies, so his personal enemies become the nation's enemies, and the boundless appetite for revenge. We see this in Erdogan and Turkey. We see this all over the world. And so public office, the whole concept of governance is totally different. And if we've grown up with democracy, no matter how flawed, it's hard to get your head around. That governance is a tool for enriching the leader and amassing so much power that his worst fear can never come to pass, and that is that he might be held accountable or forced to leave. So the idea is to make him untouchable in all ways. So, yet, this political and legalistic definition doesn't really capture the intimate devastation, the social, economic, and psychological, emotional devastation that authoritarianism brings to societies. So here's another definition. Authoritarianism can be also seen as a system in which the rights of the many are restricted or eliminated in order to give unheard of liberties and freedoms to the very few. And these are freedoms to plunder the economy, the workforce, female bodies, often male bodies too, the environment, with impunity, meaning they're going to pay no price. So the system is set up to allow them to plunder the very few. So we hear about how authoritarians hollow out institutions. And what this means is they remove anybody who's not loyal to the leader, to the party, and they staff it with sycophants. So loyalty is more important than competence. We see this coming. We see this in choice of people around the world today and in our country. But that also hollows out people. This is devastating. to the point where they will participate in acts of violence, corruption, sabotage even, against their own compatriots, against their own neighbors. And I call this process moral deregulation. Now, you know how we're seeing how when autocrats come to power, they give corporations and oil companies, they get rid of regulations, so you can do whatever you want. I have come to think of this parallel process of moral deregulation, a rolling back of civic and ethical norms against defrauding people, killing people, bullying, physically harming, norms that in a democracy are supported by civic spaces such as schools and places of worship. So all of this has to go in order to have the freedom to do whatever you want and pay no price. So that's something that gets missed because we think of fascism, communism too, as restricting, and it does. It's censorship, you can't speak. But some people are given liberty to do whatever the heck they want and pay no price. So eventually, lying and violence and corruption are institutionalized, meaning they become state policy. When you know you're in the middle of that, when criminals become lionized as patriots. And I have written in my Substack Lucid about pardons. All autocrats, they love to pardon criminals, because why should criminals sit in jail when they can be useful in government? So you gotta like switch your mentality to thinking the way the autocrat does. And truth tellers become criminals. They're treated like criminals. So the goal is what I call moral collapse, and even a move to forms of nihilism. And there's a book on Kremlin propaganda by Peter Pomerantsev, and it's called When Nothing is True, Everything is Possible, which is a very chilling idea. So all of this makes the question of why faith institutions and autocrats have regularly partnered together. It makes it more intriguing. Now, the leader sets the tone early on by appropriating religious rhetoric. The more violent and corrupt he and his regime become, the more he has to puff up his personality cult and surround himself with an aura of holiness. And to do that, he doesn't do this alone. He needs to state propaganda people. And so they appear, and it's regardless of what faith, it's just all over the world. They appear to tell us that the leader is an instrument of divine providence. We saw Steve Bannon appear on 60 Minutes and interview with The Economist to do this trick recently. And this is something that is an old thing in our country too. Muammar Gaddafi used to stop in the middle of his speeches and look up to the heavens as though he was getting direct divine inspiration. And his title was The Guide. So only they can save the nation because they have some divinely guided, everything they do, no matter how much they steal and kill, is somehow guided by divine forces. So we can look at, Henry, we can have the first slides.
Yep.
So this aura of specialness, the sense that he and only he has been chosen, inspires the personality cult standard of the idea that the leader is a man of the people, he's approachable, he's relatable, he's one of us, but he's also a man above all other men. And so he's everywhere, and he's omnipotent, and he's omnipresent. And so Modi, when he ran for office in 2014, he had himself, he appeared as a hologram. So he was everywhere and nowhere. Ethereal, and yet Modi, check out his Instagram. He's the most followed leader in the world. He's a genius at social media, at appearing approachable, and yet he's everywhere and nowhere like the hologram. So he could be in 100 rallies at once, so it's very smart. And we can move to the next one. And this is Mussolini. I'll come back to him in a second. And he was the everyman. So here, he's not trying to be godly here, but he's threshing wheat, which is the ancient peasant ritual. And yet he's got this so he's traditional, and yet he's also modern. He's got these state-of-the-art goggles on. and this is the cult of the strongmen as the savior, the defender, and all of this. And the last part is that they pretty much all of them appropriate religious rhetoric also in styling themselves as both saviors and victims. And they are martyrs. They pay the price personally to save the nation. So these are things that go across a century, across whatever kind of political regime it is. They use this rhetoric. So one of the most common questions I'm asked is how these deals work among religious institutions and strongmen. So I want to introduce the concept of the authoritarian bargain. And there's a lot of political science literature on this. These are the deals or the arrangements that autocrats strike with elites, with religious elites. And you can, Henry, go to the next slide. This is the pillars of society, and religion is one of them, the military, the media. So they strike these deals with these elites, and they get the elites get profits and power. In return, this is important, for loyalty to the leader. That has to be publicly performed, no matter what he says or does. And sadly, once these bargains are struck, they tend to be quite durable. However, and here's where the resistance comes in, every leader fears what is called in the literature elite defection. When things get too bad, and I mean in one-party states like the fascist regimes, it took being bombed by the Allies for people to start waking up, but it can come earlier in different circumstances. And elites start to defect, and then the edifice becomes more shaky. So that's the worst fear. So here we're focusing on the sphere of religion. And when we see, excuse me, when authoritarians come in and democracy weakens, we often see a realignment of power among religious institutions in a country. Now, this is in general, but faith traditions that have their own authoritarian cultures tend to prosper, and they tend to be the ones who make the deals with the leader, while progressive currents or interpretations of faith are sidelined or suppressed. And we're seeing this today in various places of militantly intolerant brands of Christianity, the idea of holy wars. These are the ones that are partnering with authoritarians around the world. Putin taking his ice bath, shirtless like Mussolini, so that whole thing going on, the virility thing. And as you all know, I'm sure, the Orthodox Church this is a great example of the partnership, and they have been on a common crusade to persecute groups and individuals and cultures that are supposedly, quote, rejecting Christian values. That's a Putin quote. And homophobia is the through line of authoritarian regimes. There are a few regimes that have, at least in the beginning, kind of talked about women's rights, like Gaddafi, but they all, in the minute they get in, they all persecute LGBTQ people. And that has happened, of course, in Russia. Sometimes I feel like in the States we're living through, we're like Russia 2014. A lot of stuff that was happening a decade ago is going on now. In return, so here he's being sort of tacitly blessed, and we all know about that. The Orthodox Church has benefited enormously from Putin's largesse, from practical things like the government gives money to restore churches, new ones have been built, this expansion of orthodoxy. But it's also an advance on the model, kind of unique, because the Orthodox Church is not just a partner and one of the pillars, it also has been made part of the intelligence apparatus, the FSB. That's unusual, but that's very important also because when the dominant church is part of the state spy network, it makes it harder for religious resistance to succeed. So Putin comes from intelligence, so he's no fool with these things. So lastly, before I get to resistance, I just want to talk about Mussolini, because he gets kind of overshadowed because we're always talking about Hitler, but he's actually in many ways more appropriate because he was a prime minister in a democracy for years. And he set the template in ways because he had a really unusual situation because the Vatican is inside Italy, right? And he himself was a well-known atheist. He hated the church. He hated the church so much because he was a revolutionary socialist in his youth that he wrote a book about a cardinal having a mistress. Like he thought the church was the height of hypocrisy. And yet, because they're transactional pragmatists, he was the one to solve the church-state question. And he made a deal with the Vatican. And and you can move to the next slide. And this is one of the very sad things about this, is that one of the things they had in common, besides defeating communists and socialists, Mussolini and the church, was that the fastest growing political movement, when Italy was still a democracy, was a progressive Christian movement called the Popular Party. And it was almost like Christian socialist, or at least Christian, very, very socially progressive. And in the 1919 and 1921 elections, they got 20%. So they came from nothing to 20%. The fascists got 1%. Nobody liked the fascists because they were violent thugs. And yet, Mussolini was appointed by the king. He comes in 1922, and so they get together, the church and the fascists, to suppress Sturzo, who was the head of Don Luigi Sturzo, very revered priest, the creator of the Popular Party. And so this was one of the things of the alliance. So here we have the first example of a progressive faith tradition that had to go. And so Sturzo, by 1924, ends up in exile. The party is dissolved, along with other opposition parties. And so that was the end for hopes of an anti-authoritarian Christian political presence in Italy until 1945, when you had Christian democracy that comes out of the resistance. So just lastly, the Lateran Accords that were signed in 1929 are an example of this kind of the benefits for each party. So they created Vatican City as an independent sovereign state, or the Vatican got autonomy. And this actually allowed the Pope to maneuver. It's very interesting. He's inside fascist Italy, which was a totalitarian state. And he's maneuvering with his independent diplomacy, independent media, from within fascist Italy. So that's really interesting. In return, Catholicism became the state religion. So not only Mussolini posters in every classroom, but also the Pope, and crucifixes returned. So each side, that's the authoritarian bargain. So I just wanted to say that. And of course, the Catholic Church had a long history after fascism, and we know about the activities of Opus Dei, which is just the far right, the farthest right sect within the Catholic Church, propping up Franco, propping up Pinochet and Berlusconi, and I was surprised when I wrote Strongmen at the number of the influence of Opus Dei adjacent people in Trump's first administration. And so that's a whole thing. So now to resistance. I just want to talk about Chile and the Catholic Church. And this is our first example of a religious institution mobilizing in important ways against a regime. Yeah, you can keep that up there. And the Catholic Church it's one of the maxims I have about resistance is that you use the spaces and tools you have at that moment, all of them. You use all the tools and spaces at your disposal because you don't know if they'll be there tomorrow. And that's what the church did. Pinochet came to power in 1973 in a US-backed coup. 1976, at the request of the Cardinal and Archbishop of Santiago, Raúl Silva Enriquez, the Vicariate of Solidarity was created. And this was part of the Catholic Church in Chile. This is incredible, what they did. It was a full-service resistance operation from within a terrible junta, military dictatorship. It had an independent radio and press that was one of the only alternate sources of information. And it assisted politicians and labor activists. It undertook legal actions for families of the disappeared. And Chile, like Argentina and Brazil, they disappeared people, they tortured people. And this was a way inside Chile to have lawyers fighting for you to know what had happened to your loved ones. So it was also because of the transnational, international circuits of the church, it was a way to get information out of Chile about torture and human rights violations, because it's not easy to get information out necessarily. So I just want to honor that. And this is a slide taken in 2023. They still have the archives and folders of people who were disappeared. They haven't been able to solve all the cases. They have a museum and an archive that remains today, and that's very important. I also want to signal that schools and universities are often places where resistance manifests early. And the Catholic University, with tacit support from the Catholic Church, became an early center of opposition in Chile. And Catholic University students would sing hymns that had, and choose passages to sing that had a resistance edge to them. And in 1979, this evolved into the Canto Nuevo musical protests. And so this flows into the big tent kind of coalitions that started the pro-democracy movement in 1983. So we often find that religion is an early indicator of resistance in a society. Okay, and Chile can inspire us today. They really did construct a big tent coalition, which eventually, years of protests, they even had a March for Joy. They held out a vision of a different Chile, optimism, hope, faith. And labor leaders, faith leaders, it really was a cross coalition. And I think about that a lot, being in the United States now. Because we know that movement building is easier if you start with people who are already organized, right? And that's why progressive faith institutions and organized labor, often education, can come together more quickly. We can take the next image, and that kind of crossing. Now, I showed you those pillars before, but we can think of resistance as also counter pillars, right? You have a resistance edifice, and you need people from all the sectors of society to make it a big tent and effective. So if you can cross labor and religion, then you're already off to a good start, or labor and education, or religion and education. So we can think about that. So that's what Reverend Barber does effectively. And now you can go back one. Yeah. Another person I also see this work in relation to a dissident evangelical pastor, Gabor Iványi, in Hungary. And all we hear about, because this is how authoritarian propaganda works, is Orban. Viktor Orban is the defender of Christianity and putting up statues to medieval saints and all of this. This is a quote from him. He's the defender of Christianity against, quote, a godless cosmos, rainbow families, migration, and open societies. And of course, he's lionized here by Project 2025 and all of that. But we don't hear, and I must have said this 1,000 times, Orban had 300 churches closed in Hungary because they were led by faith leaders who didn't agree with him or who were against him. So we need to hear more about that. So Pastor Gabor Iványi, he protests Orban's policies in the name of democracy, but he also assists the poor. He runs homeless shelters. And recently, one of them, well, not recently, but a few years ago, one of them was raided by the tax police. And so raiding a homeless shelter is kind of like an encapsulation of moral collapse. And the way, and also like in fascist Italy, one of the first things they did after they declare dictatorship is get rid of homeless from the streets because, as one of my fascist texts says, they're not very aesthetic. We need tourists to come, and we don't want to see these homeless people. So that brings me toward the conclusion, and it's very threatening to autocrats to see people in public opposing tyranny. I'm convinced, and I wrote a New York Times op-ed in June about this, the reason that the Trump administration went so quickly, escalated into military in the streets in Los Angeles, is that the sight of ordinary people helping the vulnerable and organizing against ICE could not stand for an administration that's extremely conscious of optics and images. So each time we show solidarity with others or support those who protect the rule of law, or we help the targeted, we're seen doing that, or we expose the lies and corruption, we're standing up for democratic values of justice, accountability, and we're standing up for values of kindness and empathy and solidarity. And each time we're visible on behalf of those who have disappeared or simply can no longer speak for themselves, we're modeling behaviors the authoritarian state wants us to abandon. And so each of us, I really believe each of us can be a model of those behaviors in our daily actions, as well as being part of movements and institutions that do that collectively. Joining with others, we transform our individual righteous indignation into a potent moral force for good. And that's how we can start to counter states of moral collapse. And what we have to do is shift the culture. There's been a huge deterioration, as you know, this is the moral deregulation. And we have a lot of work to do to shift the culture. It's not going to be enough to restore the institutions. We have to shift the culture back to values of love and empathy and all of that. We're seeing this potent moral charge every day now in the United States as ordinary people and clerics protest the brutal ICE raids and disappearances. The Reverend Michael Wolff, who was thrown to the ground and arrested for protesting in Chicago, along with other clerics, has diagnosed a, quote, spiritual emergency in America. And if you look at how ICE agents behave, this is moral deregulation. And if you look at the statements of people like Stephen Miller and Pete Hegseth, it's chilling. They're saying, here, they say, you can consider yourselves unleashed. That's what Miller said. Or think about Hegseth at Quantico. He said, your hands are untied now. We don't have the old rules of engagement. Everyone knows what that means. So we are living through a process of encouragement of moral deregulation and moral collapse. But to end on a hopeful note, in February, in my Substack Lucid, I often sit and go into nature and meditate and get messages. And one of the very strong messages I got, and I wrote this, 3 weeks after this nightmare started, is that out of chaos and corruption, there will be a revelation and a reckoning. Because I knew this was going to be so severe, so brutal, that it could not stand. And we are seeing that every day with ordinary people coming out, legal resistance. There's all kinds of things happening. So I am actually hopeful. But we can't leave it to the political, legalistic, institutional level. We have to work from the grassroots level up. And that's where faith institutions can be so important by themselves and in concert with others. So with autocracy expanding around the world and our political and humanitarian crisis deepening, it's more important than ever to know how authoritarianism works and also how religious resistance has unfolded, is unfolding, and what the contribution of faith institutions can be and is in the face of attacks on freedom. And I'm so grateful to be at this conference because this is part of this education, illumination, And we're all together here. I feel such a good energy from everyone. And I'm so pleased to be part of this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. I wonder if you could say more about the one of the phrases that stood out for me. The homophobia is the through line for authoritarian leaders. Why that? And just more about how we explore it and look at it. So my book Strongmen goes back over a century, and it's mostly right-wing leaders because that's my specialty. But when you do a book like that, you see the patterns and the through lines. And indeed, as I said before, women are, there's the toxic triad, as I call it, of authoritarian gender politics. Hypermasculinity, and you saw several slides of the shirtless leader. A misogyny, and women, I've written, are as much the enemies of the strongmen as journalists, opposition politicians. But homophobia is there as well. Very important, because homophobia and misogyny together are used to justify family policies, pronatalism. Now we have a return to the so-called natural family. It has to be one man and one woman, and this is espoused in Hungary, in right-wing Giorgia Meloni's Italy. So homophobia is a way to, it becomes an excuse also to carry out revisions of the social fabric and the family, as well as kind of attacks on immorality of dissenters. So it's very important, sadly, to authoritarian regimes, and that's why it truly does figure in every regime. No matter communist, fascist, they're all homophobic and they all persecute LGBTQ people.
We could get names, affiliation, and just a very quick questions that will help us get to more questions.
Hi, Roberta Todd, Bronx, Northwest Bronx Community Clergy Coalition, Christchurch, Riverdale. And my question is associated with that. When I saw how active the other faith organizations in other countries were able to take political action, do they have 501c3 restrictions?
In other countries? I mean, is this like the nonprofits and NGOs? So there's a reason that, this isn't my specialty, but I know that every autocrat goes after nonprofits and NGOs. And one of the most common things they do is any organization that dissents has to be labeled for propaganda purposes as linked to foreigners. And they did this with Navalny in Russia. They're starting to do this here too, because the idea is, I'm always trying to look for the big picture. The idea is that dissent, legal, principled dissent, has to be labeled as foreign, because it can't be innate to being a patriot. And so they construct these smear campaigns to, some NGOs, obviously, some things are transnational, but it doesn't mean that they're linked to terrorists. So you have to smear the nonprofit or the NGO as being a foreign agent. And so Putin, Hungary, many regimes and states have laws that they go after these groups. But the key psychologically or in terms of propaganda is to label them as linked to foreign terrorists, foreign infiltrators, and thus discredit them in the public's mind. The aim is always discrediting in the public's mind, so you won't support them. So you'll see them as like other. And so that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that, because it's kind of like worldwide.
And Ruth, if I might pipe in for just 1 second, we see exactly that dynamic. One of the pieces of legislation that's been proposed in the Republican Congress, I'm not sure where the legislation stands right now, but is precisely to give the Secretary of the Treasury personal unilateral authority to strip the nonprofit status of any organization that they would deem terrorism supporting, without any kind of due process or sort of legal procedure. Just the Secretary of the Treasury says you support terrorism, there goes your nonprofit status. And you know, it's a terrifying prospect.
Yeah, and the terrorist thing is, you know, Antifa, which isn't actually a thing, but is a thing, has to be a thing, is terrorist. If you go to Professor Watch List, which the Turning Point, the late Charlie Kirk founded, one of the categories, I'm on Professor Watch List, but it's not, it's the thank you. But I don't have this in my, and being a sympathizer of terrorism, and most of the people who have that among their sins listed are Muslim. And so terrorism has to be like the phantom that surrounds all kinds of critics and dissenters.
I did one center school. I thought it was really interesting how you started talking about Project 2025 and its connections with religion. I was just wondering if, like, Project 2025, if they complete the project, do you think, like, religion will help rebel against it or take part in, like, overcoming the project or trying to stop it?
It's a great question. We would hope so. And that part of Project 2025 is, it's a project for white Christian hegemony. White Christian supremacy, but hegemony. For control, for an erosion of the separation of church and state. That's going on, and already things have happened at the state level while Joe Biden was in office. So that's, and in fact, in my book Strongmen, again, written during Trump 1.0, I have little crumbs of things that have now developed where the Office of Civil Rights inside the Department of Health and Human Services was converted, and who was in charge of it? Roger Severino, who's Opus Dei adjacent. Converted from an office that helps people with civil rights concerns to a definition of civil rights as affecting white Christians. So the idea of white Christian victimhood, but only some kinds of Christians, of course. So that's one example. It's supposed to be a grassroots thing, a culture thing, a values thing, and it's supposed to be embedded in our institutions. But it's not going to work, and this is where this conference and others like it are so important, because religious institutions are the ones who are, you know, set to push back at this and reveal the stakes. It's really important to reveal the stakes, connect the dots for people.
Yeah. So my name is Oscar Romero. I'm a candidate for New York's 13th Congressional District. Thank you.
Yay.
Yes. So one of the things one of the challenges that I see, right, is that the cornerstone of what these strongmen can activate today have been built for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. Right, and how a lot of the elements of the violence that we see happening today were a bipartisan failure that are hiding that kind of moral degradation under a bunch of different tactics. You know, whether it was in the 1920s, you know, eugenicist laws that are the underpinning of the criminalization of migration, or colonial project in Latin America. So what has your research, for example, elucidated when it comes to how do we call out all these kind of establishment politics that are enabling the creation of the future strongmen?
Yeah, that's key. And I just wrote one of my latest lucid pieces is called "The Noose and the Swastika," and it talked about how from the very beginning, we're talking. I've been writing about Trump and Bannon since 2015, and they made a big tent for all racists in America. Come on in. We talked about the big tent of resistance. They were very smart, where Southern racists, so they have that tradition coming in. Neo-Nazis, they're very fine people. Okay, so you got those people, all kinds of racists who connect to these existing, people nostalgic for the Jim Crow South, people who hate immigrants. Everybody could find a home in MAGA. And in that way, they appropriated these histories of hate what I would like us to do is that we are, I'm a first generation American, and I'm so proud to be one. And I think that we have a chance, thank you, I mean, many of us are in the same category. We have a chance to actually not only defeat this, but to realize the promise, and we were getting close, of a true multiracial democracy, right? If you look at the types of the results of the 2022 midterms, there were records set for new types of people representing us. We were getting really close, and that's why there's this backlash. And that's one of the things of my book is, when do strongmen appeal? It's when you're getting close, when you have incredible progress with gender or racial emancipation or equity. That's when they come up and they're like, oh no, we got to turn the clock back. So whatever form, when we defeat this, we can't just return to the status quo. And I believe that and all over the world, there are people who are working for a different vision of democracy, right? And I believe that to guard against future strongmen coming up, we have to have the courage to not just return to the status quo, not just restore, but to work for something different. That's really important, and that's why I wanted. It's not only because I'm here speaking to this audience, to you, but it's not going to be enough to restore the institutions. We need a cultural, psychological, emotional value. We need a values-led politics, that especially with getting rid of neoliberal economics, for justice, for community, all of this. And that's partly how we will, we can set a model for the world. This is very optimistic, but I believe that we would have a chance to lead the world in a new kind of democracy.
Right here.
Hi, my name is Susan Edelstein, and I'm a member of Congregation B'nai Israel in Northampton, Mass., and Kolot Chayenu in Brooklyn, New York. I have two questions that sort of are on the edge of some of what you've talked about. You talked about homophobia, and I think for some queer people like myself, things seem pretty good. And we haven't seen that, but what we have seen is incredible attacks on trans people. So that's my first question for you to talk about, because we're not seeing gay people attacked in the same way we are seeing trans people attacked. And the second is about foreigners that you talked about in terms of nonprofits. Is the attack on foreigners and immigrants is unbelievable. I mean, it's, as a descendant of a foreigner, as probably, I don't know, 90%, actually almost 100% of the room, that's part of what, to me, is such a key point of what is happening with this administration, and so frightening. Anyway, if you could address those two things. Thanks.
So one of the things that authoritarians do is there are certain groups who are always persecuted because they represent threats, and some of them are numerous, or journalists, or often Muslims, but what the Nazis did was to pick a group that was very tiny. I'm always getting the percentage of Jews in Nazi Germany, or Weimar to Nazi Germany, wrong, but it was like less than 1%. And that they do that because hatred depends on a lack of familiarity. And you need to pick someone a group that people don't know members of that group. They don't mix with them. They don't see them at the store. And that's what the Nazis were able to do with Jews. People didn't know Jews unless they lived in cities, and so they were more likely to be influenced by state propaganda that depicted them like physically, morally, as monsters. And so we know from polling that attitudes in America towards same-sex marriage have shifted. And many people know or have someone in their family or in their community who's LGBT, not trans, right? Who's gay, let's say. But trans is a very tiny, tiny percentage, and so they become the monster. And they also tap into fascists love polarities. They love separations. I wrote a whole book on fascist film and how this translated into images. And so trans people are like, oh my God, everything is being deconstructed. So that's also why they become a target. They're a handy target.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Prit Paul Singh Kochar from the Manhattan Sikh Center. To what extent can religious organizations stand up to authoritarianism without turning violent and without letting the authoritarian resort to violence at a non-violent event?
It's a good question. So Maria Stepan and Erica Chenoweth and other researchers, there's a lot of research that to succeed, resistance should be nonviolent. And there are many, many reasons for this. It's extremely important that it be nonviolent. I'm not talking about a situation like World War II Italy, where the country was occupied and they took up arms. I'm talking about other, situations. And one of the reasons is those pillars. I talked at the very beginning, they had those pillars and talked about the terror of elite defection. If you start with violence, then you're not going to get elites to back you. They're going to be like, oh, this is toxic. And what you want as a resistor eventually is you build your grassroots movement, you build with your organizers. But in order to, this is where you have, in cases of regimes, like the old communist regimes, you need elite defections. We just saw in Syria, the reason Assad finally was gone is that the soldiers were like, I've had enough. We're not firing anymore. We're just not, they defected. Now that's different because it's in the context of years of civil war. But when we have civil resistance, it has to be nonviolent, and there's so much. Now, the other part of your question was how do we prevent the autocrat from becoming violent himself? That's a different question, and autocrats some of them dose out their violence today. There's a very good book called Spin Dictators on how violence is actually expensive for autocrats and it's costly to their image. Some of them don't care. Unfortunately, ours doesn't seem to care. But some of them do care because it alienates people. Violence can also alienate people. Wasn't it Mark Benioff who told President Trump not to bring people into San Francisco because it looks bad and it's going to disrupt things. Because when you bring in people, they start doing violent things. So that's an example. So they can be influenced, and that's why the elites are so important. They can actually influence the leader. And the last thing I'll say is numbers matter in resistance. Nonviolence matters, but numbers matter. Because if a movement grows enough, some of those elites will say, I think history's heading in a different direction. We just had an example from an unlikely place that Jamie Dimon said I was all over this. I haven't written about it yet, but very interesting. He was asked why he didn't want to contribute to the Trump ballroom. I guess they pledged it and now they're not going to do it. And he said something about there might be a future DOJ that doesn't look kindly on such things. So he's thinking ahead that maybe this Trump thing will not succeed and there'll be Democrats back. This is how they think too, right? So listen, when I meditate, one of my things is, I don't think that this will seem crazy to this crowd, but that you close your eyes and you open your senses and you be like the caterpillar and you listen and you feel and you sense things and you proceed like that. And so I listen very carefully to what people say rather than look. And I think about what I hear and what the vibe is. And these are these little moments. This is the little crack of who he is, Jamie Dimon, very important. And so we hold on to those things and we go, okay, maybe there's room to maneuver there. That's the work of resistance.
Nozomi Ikuda from Grace Congregational Church in Harlem. Thank you so much. Compelling and inspiring. I really was intrigued by your comment about we can't just go back. We have to go to something better. And so as we're building this wide tent that people are attracted to, how do we also uphold the awareness of the need to continue combating white supremacy and all of that? Thank you so much.
That's the central question. And it's really hard to both, we do have to fight to restore the status quo in many ways. We have to get our rights back. We have to undo ICE. So, but at the same time, I think that what happens is that when the state becomes a hostile force, now it's always been a hostile force for many populations in this country. You stop at a traffic light and you end up killed, right? We know this. But for more people now, the state is both a hostile force and it's absent because it does not care. And this is something that is specific to authoritarians. They don't care whether you live or die. I said this in March 2020 on a radio show, and people got really about COVID and Trump, and people were like, their heads exploded. But they don't care if you live or die. So they're going to take away FEMA. They don't care. And so what happens, this is where the reckoning and the revelation, when the state is not there, who do you depend on? Community. And you also see that community in a different way of thinking about the economy, as the economy becomes a plunder operation for rich people, it can spark thought about maybe we need a different model. But it's very hard to, we're being asked to do several things at once. And that's difficult, I understand. I don't have all the answers for how we do that, but that's what I think is necessary.